For once, let's just get the headlines done at the top of the video. People like to know what they're watching without having to wait 5 minutes for the writer to actually bloody get around to it, I've heard, so here goes. Spec Ops: The Line is rubbish. It's just rubbish. I'm not the biggest fan of third-person shooters as it is, but even I know that Spec Ops is about as derivative, bland, uninspired, and by the numbers an example of the genre as I've ever had the misfortune to come across. Purely in terms of gameplay and third-person shooter mechanics, there isn't an ounce of evolution or interest in playing with the tropes of the genre, or even a desire to create a product that is in any way polished and refined. While the setting is at times arresting and the idea of descending through a sand-flooded Dubai is a really interesting subversion of the concept of progress upwards equaling progression, the level design is so dull and so slapped together and so generic that Spec Ops: The Line completely fails as a piece of entertainment, let alone as a video game. It's so rubbish that I'm half tempted to argue that it is this bad on purpose. It was actually the one phrase inspiration for this video and my clickbait title idea. Surely though it would be a pretty ballsy group of developers to deliberately torpedo the potential success of their game by somehow making the gameplay itself a meta-commentary on the disconnect between the message of war media and the pleasure inherent in consuming that message, whether as a player, a reader or a viewer. The disconnect between the gameplay of Spec Ops and the story the game is trying to tell is profound. For all the world, the software feels like two completely different games which have never met and were written and designed in completely different planes of existence. You have the actual game with the shooting and the explosions and the bloody awful turret sequences and the sliding into cover and the waiting for enemies to stick their heads out from cover and the shooting them until they all fall over and you can move to the next really lazily designed combat arena that feels less like an actual genuine place that actual genuine people have created naturally and organically, and more like a space that was designed to give players things to hide behind in a third-person shooter game. And then you have the story part of the game, complete with both in-engine and pre-rendered cutscenes, which I'm so glad to report seem to have become a thing of the past in 2019. The story is an adaptation of Heart of Darkness, an 1899 novella by Joseph Conrad, itself having been the basis for 1979's Apocalypse Now by Francis Ford Coppola. Both of these stories deal with themes of Western civilization, a voyage into, quote, savage lands, and the effects and consequences of colonialization. The settings are different, the Belgian Congo in the novella and Vietnam in the movie, and Conrad's text doesn't situate itself within a specifically militaristic context. It is Apocalypse Now that gives Spec Ops its license to interpret the themes of the source through a specifically martial lens, with the naming of the antagonist the only explicit reference to Conrad's short story. Merely setting the game in Vietnam, however, would have felt too derivative and would likely have led to lazy restaging of the events and locations of Coppola's work. Shifting the story to Dubai conjures images of America's conflict in Iraq and Afghanistan in the opening decade of the 21st century, without straying too close to subject matter that is by all accounts still in the making, and which may have wounds that are much too fresh to be discussed in anything so third-rate as this game. The sand, the heat, the architecture, the culture, all are close enough to evoking this generation's own Vietnam without having to answer too many of the trickier questions. Dubai allows the developers to talk about the capital B big questions, namely man's complicity, the horrors of war and the unbreakable circle that forms when both are reintroduced to one another. Jaeger wanted to have this story within the context of the video game, but realised, perhaps too late, that they actually needed to create a game to go around it. For a story that wants to emphasise the role of the player in creating the horrors that they see on screen, Spec Ops is pretty coy when it comes to creating the oddly few actual moments of genuine player choice. A lot of the quite genuine barbarism that the player finds themselves participating in is actually forced on them. Spec Ops wants to have the discussion about the atrocities of war and situate that discussion within the context of the interactive medium, but it doesn't want to do any of the legwork by making that conversation mechanically coherent. The White Phosphorus episode is trying to get the player to look at themselves to consider their own role in the war crime they have just committed, but the player has no choice in their participation. You can either fire those shells or put the game down. In fact, the developers make exactly this point, arguing that simply walking away from Spec Ops and never returning to it is a perfectly legitimate response to the game, to which comment I just respond, well, how about I just don't buy your game? How about that for a legitimate response, matey? I specifically tried to find any way not to play the game the way that it wanted me to play it. The rappel point that your team used to get to ground level after the Willy Pete scene is still there, but you can't use it. Going back is not an option either. In the game, the player has no choice, certainly not a mechanical one, though in the story, Walker's actions are framed as being forced upon him, that there was no other tactical option open. Well, excuse me, but I'm just not buying it. Walker, Luco and Adams are an unstoppable force at this point, in fact at any point. There is nothing about this particular group of soldiers that makes them any tougher or more powerful than the last group that these three just minced their way through. If the game was serious about marrying mechanics and story thematically, it would have presented a genuine choice. Either burn your way through or find an alternative route, one with its own consequences. Bomb the soldiers, bomb the civilians, unbeknownst to either the player or Walker at the time. The scene is horrifying, disgusting, sickening. Your character's face is reflected in the computer screen as you control the drone as it picks targets. It's an incredible detail because, sure, any drone operator would have to reckon with their own reflection as they wreak destruction from afar. Out of context, this sequence is the most memorable and well-executed moment in the entire game. Cynical people might point to the No Russian scene from Modern Warfare 2 or the tourist scene from Modern Warfare 3 and claim that Spec Ops is merely carrying on the tradition for cheap marketing shocks that has been somewhat in vogue over the last decade or so, but I'm going to take a rare moment here to defend Spec Ops. Both of the examples from the Modern Warfare franchise are pretty isolated from their respective stories, both mechanically and geographically speaking. The No Russian scene involves walking slowly through an airport terminal, shooting innocents and, crucially, not having to duck in and out of cover and return fire with an enemy that is fighting back. The family scene from Modern Warfare 3 requires the player to briefly control a civilian as he films his family on holiday in London. There is no shooting at all, no mechanics really to speak of. Both are a notable departure from what is required of the player throughout the rest of both of those games. They are independent from the main narrative, events happening elsewhere, relatively brief interludes which fail to focus on their immediate aftermaths, the dust, the smell, the silence of places recently ravaged by incredible violence. Spec Ops gives you the fun, and I'm really using that word on advisement here, and then forces you to trudge through the flames, the charred flesh, the smoke. Ash as white as snow drifts gently in the air, disturbed only by your passing. You are forced to look upon what you have wrought. There is no running through the scene, you are forced to a walk, forced to look upon what you have done. The team discover the murdered civilians, and the player is forced to watch as Walker gazes upon the corpse of a woman, her frame frozen in death, shielding a child from the flames. Her lips and eyelids are burned away, her face a death mask, a sneer of contempt for the husk of a man standing before her. It's an incredible moment, the most memorable in the game, but is also a perfect representation of the conflict the game has between showing the player the consequences of their actions and telling them. Remove the audio from the scene and it works flawlessly, the language of cinema indicting Walker and therefore the player, as the shots alternate from Walker's horror-ravaged face and the horrific remains of the mother and child before him. The context, the pacing, everything about that scene is perfectly pitched. As a late game menu slide says, "Do you feel like a hero yet?" Return the audio, however, and in the background Luco and Adams make it quite clear that the corpses on the ground are indeed civilians and that they have indeed been murdered by Walker and his team, and that they indeed didn't have a choice. The game doesn't trust its players to comprehend what they are seeing, don't trust them to truly understand what it is they had done, so they tell them. The subtlety, the gradual sickening impact, the slow realisation implied by the visuals of the scene are completely destroyed by the audio. It's a conflict that Spec Ops grapples with throughout the 5-hour campaign, but never really resolves. There are times when the game balances the often contradictory priorities of showing and telling incredibly deftly, however, so well in fact that I can't help but wonder what sort of product we could have in front of us if more time was spent nurturing this aspect of the writing process. Let us take the most important piece of the dramatic puzzle in the story, that of the ever-shifting dynamics of the core relationships of Walker, Luco and Adams. The breakdown is handled from cutscene to cutscene with a corresponding shift in the tone of your teammates' cries in the heat of battle. As you push further into Dubai and the situation grows further and further out of Walker's control, Luco's and Adams' responses become curter, more wearied, laced with heavier hints of sarcasm. It's the best piece of storytelling in the game and does a much better job at showing the player how the events of the game are stressing the relationships of the three than all of the cutscenes with the moments where one character flat out tells another that they are falling out. Several times either Luco or Adams confront Walker over some piece of standard war atrocity or questionable decision making. It's in these moments that the developers are attempting to deconstruct the experience of participating in video games, the player's complicitness in producing the violence on screen. It's a question that Bioshock dealt with much more elegance and a much more organic story explanation that very neatly and ingeniously, I feel, explained exactly why Jack was doing what he did. Spec Ops is not nearly so clever. At the closing moments, one character asks Walker why he simply didn't turn back and go home. Walker has no answer, but the story doesn't need one because the level design provides it instead. Multiple times, Walker and his team fall through the roofs of buildings, rappel down the sides of buildings, cross zip wires, hop down to ledges from impossible heights. Geographically speaking, it is impossible for Walker to go back. The only possible way onwards for him is deeper, further down into the heart of Dubai. It's a convenient little trick, a design quirk more than any carefully constructed character drama, but looping back around to the original premise of this video, was this all on purpose? The developers certainly make no efforts to hide the seeming artificiality of their level design. I say that Spec Ops lacks any possible character motive that could move toward explaining exactly why Walker doesn't just turn and go home. Well, that's not exactly true. The game lacks any coherent motive. Turns out that Walker is mad. He has been hallucinating some things, though not all, but apparently even that is not enough to give either Luca or Adams enough of a reason to strip him of his command. The visions culminate in Conrad's penthouse at the top of the Burj Khalifa. Conrad has been dead the entire time. It's all been in Walker's head, a trick of his mind invented to help him justify everything that he has seen and everything that he has done in his long trek through Dubai. It's a convenient twist, because all of these games need twists, don't they? It is a riff on the climactic moments of both of the game's primary texts, Conrad's novella and Coppola's movie, with the protagonist, for want of a better word, being the explicitly insane one. The final confrontation puts Walker in front of a mirror, his own reflection, and Conrad's looking back at him. Walker has the choice now that he has realised the truth of what he has done. He can shoot himself, or he can shoot Conrad's reflection, who is also pointing a gun at him. If Walker dies either by his own hand or Conrad's, the game ends and Conrad's original emergency broadcaster echoes through a now dead Dubai. Kill Conrad, however, and Walker requests extraction from Dubai. In a post-credits scene, the relief arrives and Walker can choose to leave with them or gun them all down right there and then. The latter is a doubling down on Walker's part, a refusal to accept responsibility for what he has done. The former is, well, I'm not quite sure what it is. An acceptance? A coming to terms? If this was the case, surely Walker's destruction at his own hand represents a fuller, more profound acceptance of his own actions than going home and requesting forgiveness. The multiple endings of Spec Ops is the final strand of video game logic forcing its way into what would otherwise be satisfactory conclusions taken in isolation to the story that Spec Ops is trying to tell. Any of the endings that Spec Ops has on their own make sense. With several endings, however, the message is muddled, watered down, fractured into a kaleidoscope of meanings and interpretations based on the one the player chose. Curious players will no doubt reload at the base of the Burj Khalifa to experience all of the endings themselves, but I strongly suspect that for the vast majority they will simply accept their first one as canon and put down the game never to return. It is a problem almost completely unique to video games, certain experimentations in postmodern film and literature aside. While the choice inherent in the interactive medium is its greatest asset mechanically, in terms of story it is contradictory, most of the time detracting from the impact a really satisfying ending can provide. The fun comes in the different interpretations of that ending, rather than the multiple possible endings themselves. It makes Spec Ops seem confused, like it doesn't understand its own story. Maybe this is unfair. I think it might be more accurate to say that Spec Ops doesn't understand its medium. It certainly doesn't use its most defining characteristics as leverage to propel the well-worn story into anything that might halfway to be described as interesting in the context of a video game. Video games are about choice from second to second. They rely on them. They are often at their best when they offer as many to the player as possible. Spec Ops really wanted to tell the Heart of Darkness story, but they forgot to think about how they could put a different spin on that story, or how that story would inevitably change by putting a player in charge of the controls instead of an author. Thanks for watching.